Now, what exactly are the details that you know about this attack on Kryvyi Rih? Because it seems like the attacks are becoming more and more targeted on civilian areas.
Sadly, this is an old story. You know, Putin launched this massive invasion in late February of 2022. He thought he'd be able to capture Kiev and other major Ukrainian cities within a few weeks. And of course, he failed. And with that failure, especially as Ukraine launched its successful counteroffensive last summer, he had to demonstrate that he was continuing his tough war on Ukraine. And the way he showed that was by massive bombing of civilian targets. Hospitals were targeted, energy infrastructure targeted, apartment buildings targeted. So what happened this week in Kryvyi Rih is more of the same that's been going on for 16 months.
The language, John, that Zelensky is using about attacks in Russia are now inevitable, natural, and absolutely fair. The language has changed there, though, significantly, hasn't it?
Well, it reflects a little bit of confidence on the part of Zelensky and the Ukrainians. I believe that one reason why Ukraine has not struck Russia that much and has done more lately is because they were concerned about the overly cautious approach of the major Western powers, and especially the United States, who are overly concerned about provoking a nation, Russia, conducting a war full of war crimes.
But Zelensky, I suppose, he's warned further now that the war is going to come back to Russia, and we've seen these drone attacks, haven't we, in Moscow over the weekend? But they've not been entirely successful in the fact that it's been relatively limited damage, if that's what they were after. Can we expect to see more use of drones over Moscow?
It's hard to make that prediction. This tough statement Zelensky made today was to address, you might say, those in the West who believe Ukraine has no right to strike back against a country, again, conducting a war full of war crimes. And of course, in terms of morality, in terms of justice, Zelensky is absolutely right. Whether or not it makes sense to continue striking with drones in Moscow is another question, which I think he and his advisors will decide.
What do you make of what's going on at the moment in the ports in southern Ukraine and the breakdown of that grain deal, which means so much of Ukraine's harvest is unable to leave the ports without the threat of strikes from Russian missiles?
Well, this also represents the fact that Russia's military is incompetent. It's unable to win the battle with its army in Ukraine or with its navy and with its air force in Ukraine. So they're looking for other ways to achieve their objective, which is to establish their control in Ukraine. And one of the tactics is, of course, to weaken, if not destroy, the Ukrainian economy. And another is to pull others in the international community onto their side. And I think they've made a miscalculation with that. Because, despite the fact that you just had this Africa-Russia summit
yes,
in St. Petersburg,
only half the leaders turned up, didn't they?
Correct. But also, African leaders are saying Russia should restore the grain deal. In other words, any suffering in Africa because of the shortage of food is at the fault of the Kremlin, not the fault of Ukraine, not the fault of the West. And that's a very sensible reaction on their part. And hopefully it will persuade Putin to restore the Green Deal.
How much of an effect on global prices and I suppose on global energy do you think it has now? Because the world has diversified its grain supply and energy routes, hasn't it? But like you say, it's these African nations that really rely on that grain who are hardest hit by Putin's deal. So he's shooting his allies really in the foot, isn't he? By the most.
It's interesting. A year ago, when this issue first arose, Putin got, I would say, at least some support from the Arab world, from Africa, even from India and Indonesia on this. This time around, it looks like he's not getting that same measure of even tepid support. Again, that's a good thing. The problem for Putin, again, is his military is unable to achieve the goals his policy has set. So he's searching for some sort of mechanism that will achieve that objective, but so far without success finding that other mechanism. But food prices are affected by this.
Yes.
Food supplies certainly are affected by this. I think there's been a better reaction or a more successful reaction to Moscow's game with hydrocarbons. Europe managed to find its adequate supply of gas and oil last winter. Ditto for Ukraine. And I think we'll see the same this winter.
Just before I let you go, John, the general in charge of Ukraine's counteroffensive in the south has said that Russian defenses are making it difficult for military equipment, including Western tanks and armored vehicles, to push on forward. Do you think we are in a bit of a stalemate when it comes to the war, and that potentially makes some form of negotiation more likely towards the latter part of this year?
I believe that there have been almost uniformly overly optimistic expectations for the Ukrainian counteroffensive, certainly in the Western public, but maybe also with Western governments. I've been saying since March that given the level of military support for Ukraine coming from the West, I think we can expect modest success with Ukraine's counteroffensive. And I define modest success as the liberation of at least several hundred square kilometers of Ukrainian territory. That's already happened. They've taken back over 300 square kilometers. But the notion that a major Ukrainian breakthrough would happen was always a bit Pollyannish, because we have not given the Ukrainian forces the weapons they need to make that breakthrough likely. The United States still has not sent the long-range fires, the ATACMS. The United States is still blocking the supply of F-16s. And without those two weapon systems and also greater supply of tanks, a major Ukrainian breakthrough possible, but not likely. But actually, one more point, though.
Cool.
This is not necessarily a stalemate. Russia barely captured anything in its offensive. It barely got Bakhmut and announced that under threat. The Ukrainians have made some notable, albeit modest, gains.
Creating a sky defense system, though, over Ukraine, that this still seems a long way away. Having that sort of weapons and ammunitions and the ability to actually defend Ukraine's skies, we're still a long way from that, though, aren't we? Well,
point of fact, ever since the massive Russian campaign against Ukrainian infrastructure in the fall of last year, October roughly, the United States, our NATO allies have sent substantial effective anti-air equipment to Ukraine. So at least Kiev is relatively speaking well protected. But you're right, we can't give enough stuff to cover the entire country. But if we gave the things I mentioned, the ATACMS, the F-16s, and the tanks in quantity, chances of the Ukrainians busting through Russian defenses would go way up. And if in fact Ukraine were able to reach the Sea of Azov and break the Russian land bridge from Russia through occupied Donbas to Crimea, Putin would have a huge military and political problem.
Well, we'll have to watch and see if that happens. But like you say, it comes down to weaponry.
Determined Western leadership.
Yeah.
It comes down to stronger Western leadership, especially in Washington.